Okay, buckle up, because today we're diving headfirst into some seriously wild stuff. We're talking about controlling the weather.
You heard that right. We're dissecting a 1996 research paper delivered to the Air Force, and get ready for the title, Weather as a Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025.
Owning the weather, huh? Sounds like something out of a comic book. But seriously, what's the story with this paper?
So this is part of a bigger project, Air Force 2025, where they were basically trying to peek into the future of warfare. And weather control, well, that was one of the avenues they explored.
Ambitious, to say the least. But we're talking about the Air Force here, so I guess blue sky thinking comes with the territory, right? So what do these weather warriors envision?
Their core argument was pretty straightforward. Weather impacts everyone on a battlefield, right? It doesn't pick sides. So if you could control it, even a little, you'd have a massive advantage.
Turning the tables on Mother Nature, huh? So instead of being at the mercy of the elements, you're using them as a weapon.
Exactly. And they weren't the first to think this way. Even Eisenhower back in World War II knew how unpredictable weather could derail even the best laid plans. He even said, bad weather is the worst enemy of air operations.
And he would know a thing or two about that, wouldn't he?
Right. And it's not ancient history either. Think Desert Storm, where weather caused all sorts of headaches for air operations.
Okay, so the idea of controlling the weather, at least on the battlefield, has been around for a while. But how do you even begin to control something as massive and complex as weather?
Well, the paper breaks it down into two main categories. You either try to intensify what's already there, or you suppress it. And they were mainly focused on localized short-term effects, acknowledging that messing with large-scale weather patterns is a whole different ballgame, both technologically and ethically.
Yeah, I can't imagine anyone wants to be responsible for accidentally triggering a hurricane.
Exactly. So one of the more doable applications they focused on was precipitation.
Rainmaking, in other words.
Pretty much. They dug into cloud seeding, which had already been around for a bit, and even explored using something as simple as carbon black dust to influence rainfall.
Hold on, like the stuff I get on my shoes from the parking lot.
That's the one. Ever notice how much hotter a blacktop gets compared to a lighter surface? Same principle. Carbon black absorbs sunlight, heats things up, could potentially boost evaporation.
And jumpstart the rain cycle. Clever.
Right. And they didn't stop there. To deliver this carbon black, they proposed using stealth UAVs.
Stealth drones to control the weather. Talk about high tech.
It does sound pretty wild. Back then, UAVs were a pretty new thing, but the paper saw their potential for weather modification. And it wasn't just about making it rain, they also explored stopping it. Imagine keeping your troops dry while the enemy is stuck in a downpour.
Tactical downpour. I like it.
Beep, beep.
But speaking of battlefield nuisances, the paper also tackles another one, fog. Probably safe to say we've all had a flight delayed because of it at some point.
Right. Fog is a real visibility killer, which is a huge problem in military operations. They looked at different types of fog, warm and cold, and the challenges of dealing with each. Heating can clear warm fog, but it's not exactly practical on a large scale. And then there's hygroscopic seeding, which uses special agents that absorb moisture to clear the air.
Okay, so some existing techniques, but I have a feeling this is where things start to get really interesting.
You're catching on. They also looked at emerging tech, like microwaves and lasers to disperse fog. Microwaves worked in the lab but needed a ton of energy, could be dangerous. Lasers, though, were showing real promise. Even back then, they had field tests demonstrating fog clearing with lasers.
Lasers shooting down fog.
Yeah.
That sounds straight out of Star Wars.
Right. And this ties into another part of the Air Force 2025 project, where they were looking at directed energy weapons. So the idea of using focused energy for a specific goal, whether it's taking down a missile or clearing a path through fog.
Okay, but here's the kicker. They didn't just want to get rid of fog. They wanted to make, too, artificial fog. Seriously.
As crazy as it sounds, yeah. And here's the thing, it wasn't totally out there. They mentioned that the Army had already managed to create fog on a small scale.
So you're not just science fiction, then?
Apparently not. Think about the possibilities hiding troop movements, masking from infrared detection.
A real-life smokescreen. Pretty sneaky.
Yeah.
So we've covered rain and fog. What's next? Hurricanes, tornadoes.
Well, they did tackle thunderstorms, but even they acknowledged the sheer power of a thunderstorm, the ethical issues of messing with something that big. So they focused more on smaller, localized storms. Even those can be dangerous, especially for aircraft.
Still a big deal. What did they propose to do about those?
They explored ways to potentially influence their development. things like manipulating latent heat release and surface heating, basically trying to create the ideal atmospheric conditions to kind of nudge a storm into forming.
So less about controlling the storm itself and more about encouraging it to form where you want it.
In a way, yes. It's more like giving a gentle nudge in a certain direction, not full-on control. They even went as far as to suggest we might be able to, get this, modify lightning strikes.
Wait, what? You're saying weaponized lightning? That's some next level stuff.
It sounds crazy, right? But the paper actually explored both defensive and offensive uses for this. Imagine lessening the damage of a lightning strike to protect something, or even directing it toward an enemy target.
Okay, now that's just playing with fire, literally.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it?
Hmm.
But hold on to your hats because we're not done yet. We've talked about the skies, but this paper, they set their sights even higher. We're talking space.
Space weather, is that even a thing?
Oh, it's a thing. And it matters even in our everyday lives more than most people realize. Imagine a layer in our atmosphere, the ionosphere, full of charged particles acting like a giant mirror, reflecting radio waves.
Okay, I'm trying to picture it.
That's how we communicate over long distances. Those radio waves bounce off this natural mirror. But here's the catch. This mirror, it's constantly changing because of something called space weather, and that can mess with our signals, even damage satellites.
So what's the solution? Wrap the Earth in tinfoil.
They had an even wilder idea. Something called artificial ionospheric mirrors, or AIMs. Imagine using crossed microwave beams to create a controllable mirror in space.
Instead of relying on nature's finicky mirror, we just make our own, bold.
Right. And the potential benefits were huge. More reliable long-distance communication, super precise targeting of signals, even boosting our radar capabilities.
Okay, my mind is officially blown, and something tells me this is just the tip of the iceberg.
You'd be right about that. We'll dive deeper after the break.
Okay, so we've covered rain, fog, lightning, even messing with the very airwaves in space. A lot to unpack, but let's rewind for a sec. This paper we're talking about, it's from 1996. Back when the internet was still, I don't know, dial-up and those clunky cell phones with the antennas.
Yeah.
So how much of what they predicted actually panned out?
It's like they had a crystal ball, but a little blurry. Some things they nailed, others not so much. Take UAVs, for example.
You mean drones?
Exactly. Back in '96, they were basically glorified remote-controlled toys compared to what we have today.
Now you've got everything from pizza delivery to, well, let's just say the military's gotten pretty good at using them too.
Right. And it's not just the drones themselves, but the tech behind them that's come such a long way. Sensors, communication, autonomous navigation. They saw it coming, even if they couldn't have predicted just how fast and how far things would go.
So drones for weather control, cloud seeding, or even some of the crazier stuff we talked about. It's not so outlandish anymore, is it?
Let's just say the tools are there. Whether we've mastered them for that specific purpose is another question.
Fair enough. What about their other big prediction? The space weather stuff. How's that looking?
That's where things get a bit tricky. Artificial ionospheric mirrors. The science behind it is solid, but actually doing it, still a long way off. The ionosphere is incredibly complex, always changing. We can study it, make some predictions, but controlling it on a large scale, that's a whole other level of intervention. We're talking about a system driven by the sun, the Earth's magnetic field. It's not something you mess with lightly.
Sounds like a delicate balancing act. But what about the benefits they talked about? Better communication, more powerful radar. Are those things still on the table, just through different means?
Absolutely. But we're achieving them through different approaches. Mostly by understanding space weather better and designing more resilient systems. Early warning systems for solar flares and geomagnetic storms, protecting our satellites and communication networks.
So adapting rather than controlling.
Exactly. Working with nature, not against it.
Which, honestly, might be for the best. Imagine having that much control over something as fundamental as the ionosphere. It's a bit unnerving when you think about it.
I get it. It's one thing to influence a cloud. It's another to tinker with the very fabric of our atmosphere. The ethics, the geopolitical implications. It's a lot to unpack.
No kidding. So we've talked about the predictions that were spot on and the ones that are still a way off. What about the really out there stuff? Nanoclouds, artificial weather that was pushing it even for the Air Force, wasn't it?
This is where things get interesting. Remember, in 1996, nanotechnology was in its infancy.
Like comparing the first computers to a smartphone.
Exactly. The field has exploded since then. Things that seemed like science fiction back then are becoming reality. Now, we're not quite at the point of nano-engineered weather systems yet, but those building blocks are emerging.
Okay, now you're just messing with me. Nanoclouds could actually be a thing.
I'm not saying it's right around the corner, but the authors of this paper were onto something big. The potential of combining nanotechnology and weather modification. Imagine microscopic particles, each one able to sense and respond to its environment, working together to influence the weather at a molecular level.
I'm trying to picture it. My brain's just short-circuiting. It's like next level stuff.
That's what makes this paper so intriguing. It pushes us to confront the boundaries of what's possible, scientifically, ethically, strategically.
Okay, so let's talk ethics. For a minute, let's just say we could develop these technologies, nanoclouds, artificial weather, the whole shebang. Should we?
The age-old question. Just because we can doesn't mean we should. The paper acknowledges the ethical tightrope we'd be walking if we could actually control something as powerful as the weather. Who decides when and how to use it? What are the unintended consequences? These are questions that go way beyond science and into philosophy and global politics.
And I'm guessing those are questions with no easy answers.
Exactly. This paper doesn't pretend to have all the answers. Instead, it highlights the need for careful thought, open discussions as we step into this unknown territory.
So we've covered the what if, but let's bring it back down to earth for a second. Let's say we could make a super advanced weather control system. What would that even look like? How would it change warfare, strategy, global politics, everything?
You hit the nail on the head. That's what this paper is really about. It's not just about the tech itself. It's about the massive shift in thinking that comes with it.
A complete game changer, like how we see the world.
Exactly. For centuries, we've seen the weather as this totally unpredictable force. Now imagine a world where we could control it, even just a little. It would completely change the balance of power.
Yeah.
On the battlefield and on the global stage.
I can see where you're going with this. But can you give me some specifics? How would this actually play out?
Imagine a world where droughts could be prevented, or even weaponized, where storms could be steered away from vulnerable areas, or, conversely, directed toward an enemy, where control over the ionosphere could give one nation a huge advantage in communications and intelligence.
Okay, now that's getting a little scary, like something out of a dystopian movie.
And that's exactly why we need to be having these conversations. The technology in this paper might seem far-fetched, but it forces us to face a future where controlling the weather isn't a matter of if, but when.
And how we prepare for that future, ethically, strategically, morally, will shape everything.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that cheery note, let's shift gears from the hypothetical to the real world. What are other countries doing in the realm of weather modification? Are we already in a weather control arms race without even realizing it? Let's find out. Welcome back. So we've talked about the big what if of controlling the weather, the science, the potential, even some of the ethical dilemmas. But let's zoom out for a minute and look at the bigger picture. What happens when you bring other countries into the mix? Each one with their own agendas and maybe even their own weather control aspirations.
Well, it certainly adds a whole new layer of complexity, doesn't it?
To put it mildly, imagine the arguments we have over oil or water rights now. Now imagine adding control of the rain clouds to the equation. Talk about a recipe for global tension.
And that's precisely one of the concerns this paper raises. It suggests that weather modification could become a major source of international conflict in the 21st century.
Kind of ironic, considering they also pitched it as a way to maybe, possibly bring about peace. Remember that make it rain, not war idea.
Right, and that's the crux of it. Weather control, like any powerful technology, is a double-edged sword. Can be used for good or for bad. It all depends on who's wielding it and their intentions.
So let's talk about who's doing what. Are we already in a weather control arms race, even if we don't realize it?
I don't think it's quite an arms race just yet. But there's no question there's growing global interest in weather modification. Climate change is a big factor, resource scarcity, and of course, national security concerns.
Not just about winning wars anymore. It's about basic survival. Who gets the water, the arable land, control the weather, and you control a lot of our future.
Exactly. Take China, for example. They've been heavily invested in cloud seeding for decades, mainly for agriculture. They've even claimed to have successfully created rain for big events like the Beijing Olympics.
Impressive, if true. Although it does make you wonder about the implications of one nation having that kind of power.
That's a valid concern. And it's not just them. The UAE has also been experimenting with cloud seeding, trying to make their deserts bloom. And plenty of other countries, including the US, have active research programs looking into various aspects of weather control.
So it's a bit of a free-for-all out there. No real rules, just a bunch of countries tinkering with a system as complex as our planet's atmosphere. Is there anything in place to stop this from getting out of hand?
It's not a complete free-for-all. We do have international agreements, like the INMO Convention, that ban using environmental modification techniques for hostile purposes. That includes weather warfare.
But proving intent with something like a drought, natural or man-made, that's got to be tough.
Exactly. Verification is a huge challenge. How do you definitively prove that a country caused something rather than it just being, well, the weather?
Comes down to trust, doesn't it? Which, let's face it, isn't exactly in abundance in international relations these days. Add in the wild card of weather control, could get messy fast.
You're not wrong. And that's why this paper, even though it's from the 90s, is still so relevant. It reminds us that technology doesn't exist in a vacuum. It has ethical implications. It needs international cooperation, transparency, and a whole lot of caution.
Otherwise, we're not just fighting each other. We're fighting the very environment that keeps us alive. Not exactly a bright future.
Definitely something to think about as we venture further into this uncharted territory of weather control.
So, you've given us a lot to consider. As we wrap up this deep dive, what's the takeaway for our listeners? What can we actually do with all this information?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed. Have those conversations about the ethics of this kind of technology, and hold our leaders accountable for making responsible choices about developing and using it. The future of weather modification may be uncertain, but we have say in how it unfolds.
Couldn't agree more. Well, we've covered a lot of ground today, from cloud seeding to the geopolitical implications of literally controlling the weather. It's a complex and rapidly evolving field, and one that deserves our attention.
Absolutely. As this paper shows, humans have always wanted to control the weather. The question is, can we handle that power responsibly?
And on that note, we'll leave you to ponder that very question. This has been The Deep Dive. Thanks for listening.